Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 2, Chapter 16, The Battle of the Beaches, April 25, 1915. The Gallipoli Peninsula stretched into the Aegean Sea for 52 miles and is at its broadest 12 miles across. But its ankle, the isthmus, which joins it to the mainland, is only 3.5 miles wide near the village of Bulair. And at its neck, opposite Maidos, at the southwestern end, the width is scarcely 6 miles. This very considerable area is mountainous, rugged, and broken by ravines. 4 main hill features dominate the ground. The semicircular chain of hills surrounding Suvla Bay, rising to 600 or 700 feet, the Sari Bear Mountain, just over 1,000 feet high, the Kilit Bar Plateau opposite the Narrows between 600 and 700 feet high, and about 6 miles from the southwestern tip, the peak of Akibaba, also 700 feet high. Outside the straits, the landing places are comparatively few. The cliffs fall precipitously to the sea and are pierced only by occasional narrow gullies. The surface of the peninsula is covered for the most part with scrub, interspersed with patches of cultivation. A considerable supply of water in springs and wells exists throughout the region, particularly in the neighborhood of Suvla Bay. One other feature of practical significance requires to be noted. The tip of the peninsula from Akibaba to Cape Helles has the appearance from the sea of being a gradual slope, but in fact this all-important tip is spoon-shaped and thus to a very large extent protected by its rim horn direct naval fire. The operations which were now to take place presented to both sides the most incalculable and uncertain problems of war. To land a large army in the face of a long-warned and carefully prepared defense by brave troops and modern weapons was to attempt what had never yet been dared and what might well prove impossible. On the other hand, the mysterious mobility of amphibious power imposed equal perils and embarrassments upon the defenders. General Liman von Sanders knew, as we have seen, that an army estimated at between 80,000 and 90,000 men was being concentrated at Mudros, in Egypt, or close at hand. Where and when would they strike? There were obviously 3 main alternatives, and one of which might lead to fatal consequences: the Asiatic shore, the Bulair Isthmus, and the southern end of the peninsula. Of these, the Asiatic shore gave the best prospects for the landing and maneuvering of a large army. The Bulair Isthmus, if taken, cut the communications of all the troops on the peninsula, both by land and sea, and thus, in von Sanders' words, afforded the prospect of a strategic decision. Thirdly, to quote von Sanders, the strip of coast on each side of Gaba Tepe was the landing place best suited to obtaining a quick decision, as a broad depression interrupted by only one gentle rise led straight from it to Maidos. Footnote by Liman von Sanders, 5 Years in Turkey, page 80. End of footnote. There were also at the southern end of the peninsula the landing places in the neighborhood of Cape Helles, giving access to the peak of Akibaba, whence the forts on the Narrows were directly commanded. The enemy had no means of knowing which of these widely separated and potentially decisive objectives would receive the impending attack. To meet this uncertain, unknown, unknowable, and yet vital situation, the German commander was forced to divide the 5th Turkish Army into 3 equal parts, each containing about 20,000 men and 50 guns. Whichever part was first attacked must hold out for 2 or 3 days against superior numbers until help could come. To minimize this perilous interval, the communications between the three parts had been, as we have seen, improved as far as possible. Roads had been made and boats and shipping accumulated at suitable points in the straits. Nevertheless, the fact remained that Liman von Sanders must resign himself to meet in the first instance the whole of the Allied army with 1/3 of his own already equal forces. And nearly 3 days must elapse after battle was thus joined before any substantial Turkish reinforcements could arrive. In fact, however, the British commander had fewer alternatives open to him than those which Liman von Sanders was bound to take into account. Sir Ian Hamilton was under injunctions from Lord Kitchener not to involve his army in an extensive campaign in Asia, for which he had neither the numbers nor the land transport. The resources of the navy in small craft were judged not to be sufficient at this time to maintain a large army landed at Enos, 60 or 70 miles from its base at Mudros, to assault Bulair. Thus there remained in practice only the southern end of the peninsula open to the Allied attack. But as von Sanders could not know this, he must still continue to provide against all three contingencies. The issue, therefore, on the eve of battle narrowed itself down to a 3 days' struggle between the whole Anglo-French forces available, or whatever more these governments had chosen to make available, and the 20,000 Turks who, with their 50 guns, were occupying the southern end of the Gallipoli Peninsula. To get ashore and crush or wear down these 20,000 men, and to seize the decisive positions they guarded near the Narrows, was the task of Sir Ian Hamilton. And for this purpose he had in his hand about 60,000 men, and whatever support might be derived from the enormous gunpower of the fleet. It was a grimly balanced trial of strength for life and death. The first incalculable hazard was the landing under fire. This might well fail altogether. It was not inconceivable that most of the troops might be shot in the boats before they even reached the shore. No one could tell. But if the landing were successful, the next peril fell upon the Turks. They had for at least 3 days to try to hold out against superior forces. How superior, no Turk could tell. It had rested entirely with Lord Kitchener how many men he would employ. If, however, the British and French forces were too few and the Turkish defense was maintained for 3 days, then the balance of advantage would turn against the Allies. After the 3rd or 4th day, the attackers would have expended their priceless treasure of surprise. Their choice would be disclosed, and they would be committed almost irrevocably to it. Large reinforcements would reach the Turks, strong entrenchments would be completed, and ultimately the invaders would have to meet the main forces of Turkey, which could gradually be brought against them from all parts of the Ottoman Empire. Rapidity and intensity of execution at the outset were therefore the essential of any sound plan. At daybreak on April 25, Sir Ian Hamilton began his descent upon the Gallipoli Peninsula. The story of the Battle of the Beaches has been often told and will be often told again. From the somber background of the Great War, with its inexhaustible sacrifices and universal carnage, this conflict stands forth in vivid outline. The unique character of the operations, the extraordinary amphibious spectacle, the degree of swiftly fatal hazard to which both armies were simultaneously exposed, the supreme issues at stake, the intensely fierce resolve of the soldiers, Christian and Moslem alike, to gain a victory the consequences of which were comprehended in every rank, all constitute an episode which history will long discern. It would not be fitting here to recount the feats of arms which signalized the day. To do them justice, a whole volume would be required. Each beach deserves a chapter, each battalion a page. Only the principal features of their consequences can here be traced. Sir Ian Hamilton's plan comprised two main converging attacks on the southern end of the peninsula. The first by the 29th Division at 5 separate simultaneous landings in the vicinity of Cape Helles. The second by the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps near Gabatepe, opposite Maidos. Both these attacks would have become related in the event of either making substantial progress, and both drew upon the resources of the two Turkish divisions, which alone were available at this end of the peninsula. In addition, the French were to make a landing on the Asiatic shore near the ruins of Troy to effect a temporary diversion, and the Royal Naval Division in transports, accompanied by warships, pretended to be about to land at Bulair. Liman von Sanders has described in rugged sentences the scene at the Turkish headquarters in the town of Gallipoli when, in the early morning, the news of the invasion arrived. From 5 a.m. onwards on April 25, reports of great landings of enemy troops already begun or about to begin followed rapidly one on another. In the south, beginning on the Asiatic side, the 11th Division reported great concentration of enemy warships and transports in and off the Great and Little Besika Bays, and a landing threatening. Somewhat further north, at Kumkale, the outposts of the 3rd Division were already in lively combat with the French troops which had landed there, covered by the fire of numerous French warships. At the southern tip of the Gallipoli Peninsula, strong British forces fought the outposts of the 9th Division for possession of the landing places. The whole stretch of coast here and its hinterland lay under the fierce fire of large-caliber British naval guns. At Gabatepe and on the site of the previously mentioned Maidos Gap, troops were being disembarked from British warships, whilst enemy warships lying in a half-circle searched the ground in rear with the fire of the largest calibers. Near us, in the upper Gulf of Xeros, numerous warships and transports were approaching the coasts. From there also the roar of continuous gunfire was soon plainly to be heard. It was evident from the white faces of the reporting officers at this early hour that, although a hostile landing had been fully expected, its occurrence at so many places at once had surprised most of them and filled them with apprehension. My first feeling, he adds with some complacency, for he was completely deceived as to which were the true and which the feint attacks, was that there was nothing to alter in our dispositions. The enemy had selected for landing those places which we ourselves had considered would be the most probable and had defended with special care. He proceeded forthwith to where he considered the greatest danger lay. Personally, I had to remain for the present at Bulair, since it was of the utmost importance that the peninsula should be kept open at that place. Thither he also ordered immediately the 7th Division encamped near the town of Gallipoli. All day long, in spite of the news that reached him of the desperate struggle proceeding at the other end of the peninsula, he held this division and the 5th intact close to the Bulair lines. It was only in the evening that he convinced himself that the ships and transports gathered in the Bay of Xeros were intended as a feint, and even then he dared only to dispatch by water 5 battalions from this vital spot to the aid of his hard-pressed forces beyond Maidos. Not until the morning of the 26th, 24 hours after the landings had begun, could he bring himself to order the remainder of the 5th and 7th Divisions to begin their voyage from Bulair to Maidos, where they could not arrive before the 27th. Thus, in his own words, The upper part of the Gulf of Xeros was almost completely denuded of Turkish troops. And finally, only a depot pioneer company and some labor battalions occupied empty tents along the ridge. The removal of all the troops from the coast of the upper part of the Gulf of Xeros, he writes, was a serious and responsible decision on my part in the circumstances, but it had to be risked in view of the great superiority of the enemy in the southern part of the peninsula. Had the British noted this weakness, they might well have made great use of it. Nothing more clearly reveals the vital character of the Turkish communications across the Isthmus of Bulair than the solicitude for them manifested at this juncture by this highly competent soldier. It is well to ponder in the light of this fact upon Lord Kitchener's observation. Once the fleet has passed the straits, the position on the Gallipoli Peninsula ceases to be of importance. We must return to the Battle of the Beaches. Of the 5 landings in the neighborhood of Cape Helles, that of the 88th Brigade on V Beach, close to the ruined fort of Zet el Bahr, was intended to be the most important. Over 2,000 men of the Dublin and Munster Fusiliers and of the Hampshire Regiment, packed in the hold of the River Clyde, a steamer specially prepared for landing troops, were carried to within a few yards of the shore. It had been planned to bridge the intervening water space by 2 lighters or barges. Along this causeway the troops were to rush company by company on to the beach. At the same time the rest of the Dublin Fusiliers approached the shore in boats. There were scarcely more than 400 or 500 Turks to oppose this assault, but these were skilfully concealed in the cliffs and ruined buildings, reinforced by a good many machine guns, and protected by mines and wire, both in the water and ashore. As the Irish troops rushed from the hold of the River Clyde, or as the boats reached the submerged barbed wire, an annihilating fire burst upon them from all parts of the small amphitheatre. The boats were checked by the wire or by the destruction of their rowers. The lighters, swayed by the current, were with difficulty placed and kept in position. In a few minutes more than half of those who had exposed themselves were shot down. The boats, the lighters, the gangways, the water, and the edge of the beach were heaped or crowded with dead and dying. Nevertheless, the survivors struggled forward through the wire and through the sea, some few reaching the beach, while successive platoons of Dublin and Munster Fusiliers continued to leap from the hold of the River Clyde into the shambles without the slightest hesitation until restrained by superior authority. Commander Unwin and the small naval staff responsible for fixing the lighters, and indeed for the plan of using the River Clyde, persevered in their endeavours to secure their lighters and lay down gangways unremittingly in the deadly storm, while others struggled with unsurpassed heroism to save the drowning and dying, or to make their way armed to the shore. The scenes were enacted once again, which Napier has immortalized in the breaches of Badajoz. Nothing availed. The whole landing encountered a bloody arrest. The survivors lay prone under the lip of the beach, and but for the fire of the machine guns of Commander Wedgwood's armoured car squadron, which had been mounted in the bows of the River Clyde, would probably have been exterminated. The Brigadier General Napier being killed, the whole attempt to land at this point was suspended until dark. Fighting scarcely less terrible had taken place at W Beach. Here the Lancashire Fusiliers, after a heavy bombardment from the fleet, were towed and rowed to the shore in 30 or 40 cutters. Again the Turks reserved their fire till the moment when the leading boats touched the beach. Again its effects were devastating. Undeterred by the most severe losses from rifle and machine gun fire, from sea mines and land mines, this magnificent battalion waded through the water, struggled through the wire, and, with marvelous discipline, actually reformed their attenuated line along the beach. From this position they were quite unable to advance, and this attack also would have been arrested but for a fortunate accident. The boats containing the company on the left had veered away towards some rocks beneath the promontory of Cape Teke. Here the soldiers landed with little loss, and climbing the cliffs fell upon the Turkish machine guns which were sweeping the beach and bayoneted their gunners. Profiting by this relief, the remainder of the battalion, already on the beach, managed to make their way to the shelter of the cliffs, and climbing them, established themselves firmly on their summit. Here, at about 9 o'clock, they were reinforced by the Worcesters, and gradually, from this direction, the foothold won was steadily extended during the day. Still further to the left of the Royal Fusiliers had landed at Axe Beach, admirably supported at the closest ranges by the implacable Captain H.C. Lockyer. They were followed by the Inniskillings and the Border Regiment, and by fierce fighting and a resolute charge carried the high ground above Cape Teke, thus establishing connection with the troops from W Beach. A mile to the left of Axe Beach again, 2 battalions of Marines were landed without a single casualty at Y Beach. These were attacked at nightfall and early the next morning signaled for boats and re-embarked. They, however, drew to their neighborhood important Turkish forces and thus for a time aided the other attacks. At the other end of the line at S Beach, on the extreme right, rear the old fort called De Tott's Battery, another battalion was easily landed and maintained an isolated position. When darkness fell, the remaining troops in the River Clyde managed to get ashore without further loss, and gradually secured possession of the edge of V Beach, and some broken ground on either side of it. Thus, when the day ended, lodgments had been effected from all the 5 beaches attacked, and about 9,000 men had been put on shore. Of these, at least 3,000 were killed or wounded, and the remainder were clinging precariously to their dear-bought footholds and around the rim of the peninsula. We must now turn to the second main attack. It had been intended to land the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps near Gaba Tepe, with the purpose of striking across the neck of the peninsula towards Maidos. In contrast to the landings of the 29th Division at Helles, this all-important descent was to take place before dawn and without artillery preparation. It was hoped that, while the Turkish forces were involved at the end of the peninsula with the 29th Division, the Anzacs would make great headway in its most vulnerable part. The arrangements provided for successive landings from boats and launches, aided by destroyers, of 1,500 men at a time. A rugged and difficult spot, half a mile north of Gaba Tepe, unlikely to be elaborately defended, was chosen for the landing. In the dark, the long tows of boats missed their direction and actually reached the coast a mile further to the north, entering a small bay steeply overhung by cliffs, till then called Ari Burnu, but in future Anzac Cove. This accident led the attack to a point quite unexpected by the defenders. The actual landing was made with little loss, and the foot of the cliffs proved in practice well sheltered from artillery fire. On the other hand, it carried the Australian advance away from the broad depression from Gaba Tepe to Maidos into the tangled and confused underfeatures and deep ravines radiating in all directions from the mountain of Sari Bair. It also still further separated the Anzac attack from that of the 29th Division at Cape Helles. As the flotilla approached the shore, a scattered fire from the Turkish pickets rang out, but the Australians, leaping from the boats into the water or onto the beach, scrambled up the cliffs and rocks, driving the Turks before them in the dim but growing light of dawn. The destroyers were close at hand with another 2,500 men, and in scarcely half an hour upwards of 4,000 men had been landed. The skirmish, developing constantly into an action, rolled inland towards the sunrise, and by daylight considerable progress had been made. By 7:30, 8,000 men in all had been landed. In spite of rifle and artillery fire, which steadily increased against the beach, by 2 o'clock the whole infantry of the leading Australian division, 12,000 strong, and 2 batteries of Indian mounted artillery were ashore, occupying a semi-circular position of considerable extent. The 2nd Division, including a New Zealand brigade, followed, and within a period of 24 hours, in all 20,000 men and a small proportion of artillery were effectively landed. The 2 Turkish divisions, who were left without help of any sort to face the onslaught of the Allied army, were shrewdly disposed. 9 battalions of the 9th Division guarded the likely landing places around the coast from Gabatepe to Morto Bay. The remaining 3 battalions of that division and the 9 battalions forming the 19th Division were all held concentrated in reserve near Maidos. At the head of the 19th Division there stood, in this strange story, a man of destiny. Mustafa Kemal Bey had on April 24 ordered his best regiment, the 57th, a field exercise for the next morning in the direction of the high mountain of Sari Ber, Hill 971, and, as fate would have it, these 3 battalions stood drawn up on parade when, at 5:30 a.m., the news of the first landings came in. A later message reported that about 1 British battalion had landed near Ari Burnu and were marching upon Sari Ber. Both Sami Pasha, who commanded at the southern end of the peninsula, and Sanders himself regarded the landing at Ari Burnu as a feint, and Mustafa Kemal was ordered merely to detach a single battalion to deal with it. But this general instantly divined the power and peril of the attack. On his own authority, he at once ordered the whole 57th Regiment, accompanied by a battery of artillery, to march to meet it. He himself on foot, map in hand, set off across country at the head of the leading company. The distance was not great, and in an hour he met the Turkish covering forces falling back before the impetuous Australian advance. He at once ordered his leading battalion to deploy and attack, and himself personally planted his mountain battery in position. Forthwith, again without seeking higher authority, he ordered his 77th Regiment to the scene. By 10 o'clock, when the Turkish commander-in-chief galloped on to the field, practically the whole of the reserves in the southern part of the peninsula had been drawn into the battle, and 10 battalions and all the available artillery were in violent action against the Australians. Footnote: this episode is well described in the Australian official history. End of footnote. Bitter and confused was the struggle which followed. The long-limbed athletic Anzacs thrust inland in all directions with fierce ardor as they had sprung pell-mell ashore from the boats, intent on seizing every inch of ground that they could. They now came in contact with extremely well-handled and bravely led troops and, momentarily, increasing artillery fire. In the deep gullies, among the rocks and scrub, many small bloody fights were fought to the end. Quarter was neither asked nor given. Parties of Australians cut off were killed to the last man. No prisoners, wounded or unwounded, were taken by the Turks. Meanwhile, on both sides, reinforcements were being hurried into the swaying and irregular fire line. All through the day and all through the night the battle continued with increasing fury. In the actual fighting lines on both sides, more than half the men engaged were killed or wounded. So critical did the position appear at midnight on the 25th, and so great was the confusion behind the firing line, that General Birdwood and the Australian brigadiers advised immediate re-embarkation, observing that decision must be taken then or never. But at this juncture the Commander-in-Chief showed himself a truer judge of the spirit of the Australian troops than even their most trusted leaders. Steady counsel being also given by Admiral Thursby, Sir Ian Hamilton wrote a definite order to dig in and stick it out. From that moment, through all the months that followed, the power did not exist in the Turkish Empire to shake from its soil the grip of the antipodes. All through the night of April 26, the position at V Beach continued critical. The landing place was still exposed to the Turkish rifle fire, and a further advance was imperative if any results were to be achieved. Accordingly, at dawn on the 26th, preceded by a heavy bombardment from the fleet, the remnants of the Dublin and Munster Fusiliers and of the Hampshire Regiment were ordered to assault the castle and village of Sed el Bahr. Undaunted by their losses and experiences, unexhausted by 24 hours of continuous fighting, these heroic troops responded to the call. By 9 o'clock they had stormed the castle, and after 3 hours house-to-house fighting made themselves master of the village. A Turkish redoubt, strongly held by the enemy, lay beyond. The wasted battalions paused before this new exertion, and the redoubt was subjected to a violent and prolonged bombardment by the battleship Albion. When the cannonade ceased, the English and Irish soldiers mingled together, animated by a common resolve, issued forth from the shattered houses of Sed el Bahr, and in broad daylight, by main force and with cruel sacrifice, stormed the redoubt and slew its stubborn defenders. The prolonged, renewed, and seemingly inexhaustible efforts of the survivors of these 3 battalions, their persistency, their willpower, their physical endurance, achieved a feat of arms certainly in these respects not often, if ever, surpassed in the history of either island race. The reorganization of the troops at the water's edge, the preparation and inspiration of these successive assaults, are linked with the memory of a brave staff officer, Colonel Doughty Weil, who was killed, like Wolfe, in the moment of victory, and whose name was given by the army to the captured fort by which he lies. As the result of these successes and of the continued pressure of the British attack from its various lodgements on the enemy, a continuous arc was established by the evening of the 26th along the whole coast from V, W, and X beaches, and a junction was effected with the single battalion landed at S. Profiting by the exhaustion, heavy losses, and inferior numbers of the Turks, and reinforced by 4 French battalions, the Allies on the 27th converted this concave arc by a further advance into a line from a point about 2 miles north of Cape Teke to De Todd's Battery. The extreme tip of the Gallipoli Peninsula had thus been bitten off. All the beaches were protected from rifle fire, and a substantial foothold had been established and consolidated upon land. The rest of the 29th Division, the Royal Naval Division, and the French Division, having landed during the 26th and 27th, Sir Ian Hamilton ordered on the 28th a general advance from the tip of the peninsula towards Kretia village. Although the Turks were beginning to receive reinforcements and had reorganized, They considered this a very critical day. The troops which had opposed the landing had lost heavily. Their battalions were reduced to about 500 strong. By midday, the whole of the Turkish reserves were engaged. The British and French, however, were not strong enough to make headway against the Turkish rifle fire. Once inland in the spoon-shaped dip, the ship's guns could not help them much, and they had not had time to develop their own artillery support. By the evening of the 28th, therefore, a complete equipoise was reached. If during the 28th and 29th 2 or 3 fresh divisions of French, British, or Indian troops could have been thrown in, the Turkish defense must have been broken, and the decisive positions would have fallen into our hands. And all the time the lines of Boulaire lay vacant, naked, unguarded, the spoil of any fresh force which could now be landed from the sea. Where was the extra army corps that was needed? It existed. It was destined for the struggle. It was doomed to suffer fearful losses in that struggle. But now, when its presence would have given certain victory, it stood idle in Egypt or England. The next move lay with the Turks. Reinforcements were steadily and rapidly approaching the hard-pressed 2 divisions. The leading regiments of the divisions from Boulaire were already arriving at intervals. The 15th Division was coming by sea from Constantinople to Kilia Liman. The 11th Division was crossing from the Asiatic shore. In this situation the 29th and 30th passed away without event. On the morning of the 27th we received at the Admiralty a telegram from Admiral de Robeck giving an account of the battle. I took this across at once myself to Lord Kitchener. As soon as he saw that 29,000 men had been landed, he expressed the most lively satisfaction. He seemed to think that the critical moment had passed, and that once the troops had got ashore in large numbers, the rest would follow swiftly. But the news of the heavy losses that came in on the 28th and the further telegrams which were received showed the great severity and critical nature of the fighting. On this day, therefore, Lord Fisher and I repaired together to the War Office and jointly appealed to Lord Kitchener to send Sir Ian Hamilton large reinforcements from the troops in Egypt and to place other troops in England under orders to sail. Fisher pleaded eloquently and fiercely, and I did my best. Lord Kitchener was at first incredulous that more troops could be needed, but our evident anxiety and alarm shook him. That evening he telegraphed to Sir John Maxwell and Sir Ian Hamilton, assigning an Indian brigade and the 42nd Territorial Division, then in Egypt, to the Dardanelles. There was no reason whatever why these forces and others should not have been made available as a reserve to Sir Ian Hamilton before his attack was launched, in which case the preparations for bringing them to the peninsula would have been perfected simultaneously with those of the attack, and the transports could have carried them to the peninsula the moment the beaches were ready for their reception. These reinforcements, aggregating 12,000 or 13,000 rifles, could have fought in the battle of the 28th or enabled it to be renewed at dawn on the 29th. In fact, however, the Indian Infantry Brigade did not land until May 1, and the leading brigade of the 42nd Division did not disembark until May 5. Meanwhile, reinforcements from all quarters and artillery taken from the defences of the Straits were steadily reaching the Turks. By May 1, the local German commander, Soudenstern, thought himself strong enough to begin a general counterattack, and during the whole of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd he continued to thrust in his troops, wearied as they were, either by march or battle, in a series of desperate and disconnected attempts to drive the Allies into the sea. But if Sir Ian Hamilton's army was not strong enough to advance itself, neither could it be shaken from its position. By May 3, the Turkish attacks had broken down completely, with very heavy loss. The first wave of Turkish reinforcements had spent itself, and it was again the turn of the Allies. The organization of the beaches had been established. Supplies, artillery, and ammunition had been landed in considerable quantities. There was nothing to prevent a renewed general advance on the 4th or 5th against the discouraged Turks, had additional troops proportionate to the new situation been available. As it was, the attack could not be begun until the 6th, and so short of troops was Sir Ian Hamilton that he found it necessary to withdraw the 2nd Australian Brigade and the New Zealand Brigade from the Anzac area to Helles. The new battle commenced on the morning of the 6th and was continued on the 7th and 8th. It was sustained by nearly 50,000 British and French troops with 72 guns, against which the Turks mustered approximately 30,000 men and 56 guns. The result was a great and bitter disappointment for the Allies. Only a few hundred yards were gained along the whole front. The losses both of the British and French had been very heavy. In all, from the 25th to the cessation of the attack on the evening of the 8th, the British had lost nearly 15,000 killed and wounded, and the French at least 4,000. The situation disclosed on the morrow of this battle was grim. Sir Ian Hamilton's whole army was camped and pinned down at two separate points on the Gallipoli Peninsula. His two main attacks, though joined by the sea, were now otherwise quite disconnected with each other. None of the decisive positions on the peninsula were in our hands. A continuous line of Turkish entrenchments stood between the British and Aki Baba, and between the Australians and the mountain of Sari Bair, or the town of Maidos. These entrenchments were growing and developing line upon line. The French having been withdrawn from Troy, the Turkish troops in Asia were free to reinforce the peninsula. All the available British reserves, including the Indian Brigade and the 42nd Division, had been thrown in and largely consumed after their opportunity had passed. The casualties in every battalion had been serious, and there was no means at hand of filling the gaps. Not even the regular 10% reserve, which follows automatically every division sent on active service, had been provided for the 29th Division. On the 9th, Sir Ian Hamilton reported that it was impossible to break through the Turkish lines with the forces at his disposal, that conditions of trench warfare had supervened, and that reinforcements of at least an army corps were needed. At least a month must intervene before the drafts needed to restore the divisions already engaged and the large new forces plainly required could be obtained from home. What would happen in this month of continued wastage in the Allied army and of unceasing growth in the Turkish power? Initiative and opportunity had passed to the enemy. A long, costly struggle lay before us, and far greater efforts would now certainly be required.